Iron buildings, like timber buildings and like Singapore Cottage and so on, had first been sent to California for the gold rush there, which is important because it meant that manufacturers in England were familiar with the idea of making such things and exporting them, so they could respond quickly when gold was discovered in Victoria. And many of them had other strings to their bow, like Edward Taylor Bell House was a millwright essentially, so elements used in mill buildings are introduced in his iron buildings for California and then for Melbourne. This is a warehouse he sent to San Francisco in 1850. Now typically these warehouses and stores would have the store space on the ground floor and living quarters above, because it was normal to live above your store for security in a goldfield situation. And even later on, the staff would be housed in dormitories upstairs over the store on the ground floor. Now this one is clad in vertical corrugated iron, but he soon abandoned that system in favour of his patent system, here in 1853 patent, in which the iron runs horizontally. A bit hard to make this out, but looking at the section at the left, that's the iron running horizontally between vertical cast iron columns. And here's a building of that sort. What happened is that Prince Albert, the Prince Consort, went to the Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace and saw Bellhouse's buildings. This is just before his patent, but the same essential system, and was fascinated by them, and he orders a ballroom to be put up at Balmoral, the royal house in Scotland. And that building, surprisingly, still survives today, where it's now a carpenter's workshop, but in very good condition. And there's only one other building on this system which survives in the world. We'll just pass over those nice details. And that's this cottage here, which was put up in Fitzroy, Melbourne, then demolished and removed by the National Trust and reconstructed in South Melbourne. The window at the left is something I mentioned before. The 4 panes at the middle pivot. And that's a detail used in cotton mills, which Bellhouse would have been accustomed to using even before he got into building buildings for export. There it is as re-erected in South Melbourne. Missing components, unfortunately. And here's his biggest building in Melbourne, which is Cloppen's Royal Olympic Theatre in what is now Exhibition Street. Although the front has that grand glazed front, most of the building was built on the same patent system. The big arched roof, of course, in the background is that of the auditorium itself. Now, the colonial architect, Henry Ginn, was commissioned to try and order buildings from overseas for public servants. And he first proposed to import timber buildings and in the end imported iron buildings from British makers. And this is one of those buildings. It's an iron house, now standing at Inverleigh to the west of Geelong, but seems to be part of the first batch of iron buildings made by John Walker of London and imported for the Victorian government. How it got into private hands here is not entirely clear. But although it's only a shell today, when you look at it, you find that the galvanising is almost completely intact. Such was the quality of the coating itself, which is generally speaking first tin and then zinc, not just zinc, and also the quality of the corrugated iron, which was very heavy gauge and therefore didn't dent, which meant much less likelihood of the coating being chipped off it. So the rust here is only on the later roofing and on some of the wrought iron components that join the panels together. The structure is a unique form here. The whole building is framed in panels of angle iron, galvanised angle iron, and then joined at the base with iron gussets. And there's no other maker who does this precise thing. There on the right hand side you can see John Walker's maker's plate, unfortunately partly obscured, but John Walker of Millwall, Poplar, London. And there's some of the original numbering still visible on the galvanised iron verticals, and there's a drawing which corresponds with that numbering almost exactly. There it is here. This is showing combined one long elevation and one end elevation, and the numbers are on it. And as I say, it's actually one digit off those which we found on the building itself. What's puzzling is that the same detailing occurs in another building which is not made by John Walker, apparently. This is the Rangers House in Parkville, built on the corner of Royal Park that comes close to Royal Parade at Gatehouse Street, occupied by the Park Ranger. The plate looks similar, but it's by a different maker. It's Walmsley, a London ironmonger. And Walmsley was a common garden iron, like a hardware merchant really. He could supply it's called corrugated iron, but he wouldn't have supplied fabricated buildings like this in this special fashion. And I feel fairly certain that what happened was that the government, having chosen the Walker houses, needed to get competitive prices to satisfy public requirements, and the Victorian agent in London would have been set to arrange that, and a competition was faked up so that Walmsley put in a price that probably the buildings were actually made still by John Walker. Here's the side of that Ranger's house in Parkville. Next, a different maker again, different characteristics, is Edwin Moore of Liverpool. Here are two buildings made by Edwin Moore which survived in fairly recent times at Numbar in New South Wales. The left-hand one was a house which became part of a hotel, and the right-hand one a long shed. And over the road from here was a similar building which became, although it looks like a shed, was in effect an iron church, a Presbyterian church. These were all built in 1854, that number, and if you go to the side of the church, you see it has heavy cast iron columns, classical pilasters. Inside it, the structure is very extraordinary. Although much of it is gone, the pilasters are joined together with horizontal girts, which are a bit like a bicycle chain. Here's a detail. There are two straps running horizontally, and there are spaces between them, little cylindrical spaces, and pins between them. And the same sort of bicycle chain arrangement goes across the roof, the top quarter of the truss, and even below the floor. And this seems to be, again, something which Edwin Moore had developed in England for other purposes and just turned to use in his buildings, iron buildings. Because Edwin Moore had been a maker of railway rolling stock. And I believe these girts were designed for the sides of goods carriages, where you could roll a canvas down the side and seal the wagon off as required. And he just used them for the house in the same sort of way. Here's a building of the same construction in Tasmania by Edwin Moore. And here you can see the same girt a bit more clearly. There it is there. And even here, tying the floor together. It would be below timber boarding in this building. And that's the walling system. So you can see that you can move that left-hand side there, that little chair for the fixing bolt, move it along as required, so bolts into the galvanised iron, corrugated iron cladding on the outside. Yet another building in Tasmania on the same construction. And there's the maker's name cast into the column. Now, most of the corrugated iron that came to Australia was, roughly speaking, what we'd be familiar with today. That is 3-inch normally, about 75mm pitch. That is the distance between the crest of each corrugation, about 75mm. But the larger size iron, which is notionally 5-inch, 125mm, often rather larger than that in fact, tends to be from Scotland. And Scottish iron tends to be much heavier in gauge, and unlike English iron, is not marked with the maker's name stenciled onto it, but may have little discrete stamps on it which indicate at least the batch numbers, if not the name of the maker. And here's one example of a building made in Scotch iron, and it's probably a Scotch building, which stood at Keilor off the Calder Highway until recent times. And there's that rather crude corner column, an angled column in cast iron. And this building has been recently moved and restored on a new site in Keilor. But there's the plan of it. And there is a comparison of that corner column on the left with another building entirely. You see a similar recessed curved top panel with a cross above it. The building on the right-hand side is a large two-storey house at Yappeen or Guildford near Castlemaine. There it is there as it was. I now believe this house was first built in Castlemaine and only a few years later was sold and moved to Guildford, and it became what's now known as Marsh House. A surprising characteristic about it is it looks as though it may have been a semi-detached pair, because not only are the windows paired, as you can see in that view there, but the doors, in fact, two doors with separate frames next to each other. The two doors, although those doors are 20th century doors themselves, but the frame between is the original frame. And here you can see the heavy gauge iron and the cast iron corner pilaster and the bolts holding it together. Timber casement windows. Now turning to some other Scottish and better documented Scottish buildings. These were a whole village of small iron cottages in South Melbourne, all imported by one maker, one person, Robert Patterson, after whom Patterson Place, South Melbourne, is named. They went down both sides of Patterson Place, which is a cul-de-sac. Where we are standing in the foreground, it crosses into Montague Street, and if you went from where we are to the left along Montague Street and then turned right again, you'd be in Coventry Street, which is the front of the same block of land. And apart from these small two-roomed houses with little attics at the top, reached by a ladder, on Coventry Street and elsewhere he made larger houses of 4 rooms with a proper staircase and 2 separate rooms in the attic. This is the one that was built on the site but acquired by the National Trust and restored many years ago. It consists of wrought iron framing, that is wrought iron angles at the corners and T's in between, corrugated iron running vertically and horizontally, really however it's convenient to place it, no patent system like Bellhouse, window sashes which are very beautifully made, heavy cast iron, and the same components are used in both the small and the larger of these houses. But here is a 2-storey building using similar components. The same sashes are there behind those screens in the upper windows, the same combination of vertical and horizontal corrugated iron, the same wrought iron T-sections, but at the corners, this being a 2-storey building with greater structural requirements, those in fact are cast iron angles at the corners. And this building, which was a store building brought out as a warehouse and living quarters like the ones I spoke about before, was made by Robertson and Lister of Glasgow. So we now know that Robertson and Lister of Glasgow made the small houses in Patterson Place, the larger houses in Coventry Street, this store in Mercer Street, Geelong, in the corner of Ginn and Mercer Street, Geelong. And as it stood originally, it looked like that, very elaborate facade with plate glass in the front, and again, as I said, the living quarters above the store below. And it's been restored today to this form here. And a similar building is this one here, arched roof building from the catalogue of C.D. Young and Company, who took over the business of Robertson Lister. So, in fact, all the buildings we know of with Young's name on were in fact made by Robertson Lister, who went broke and Young bought the business. Now this is now a complete cast iron facade. Everything you see there apart from the glass is cast iron. And this building was sent out as a warehouse to Melbourne, but was sold to the New South Wales government, taken to Sydney to become the first Legislative Council chamber, and put up in Macquarie Street. The facade's been moved forward towards the street, and the curved top has been given a pointed gable on top, but is otherwise intact. And until recent times, people all assumed this was a masonry facade, maybe stuccoed facade, had no idea that it in fact was cast iron made in Scotland. There's the only example we know of these houses which was built in Glasgow itself. Same system of cast iron plate front, but that building has now been demolished. So the only buildings made by this firm, Robertson Lister, in the world today, only prefabricated buildings made by them, are in Australia. Here's another from the same catalogue, a house made by Robertson Lister, designed by the Glasgow architects Bell and Miller, sent out to the order of a land commissioner, William Nairn Gray, who died before it arrived. And in fact, it would have been very difficult for him to build it because it was sent to Geelong, which is a port, there was no problem there, but it would have had to go overland to Hamilton, where he was based, and there were no proper roads. It was really almost impossible thing to do, to take a heavy house like this inland in Victoria. Anyway, in the event, he died, and the merchant who imported the building for him bought the building and used it as his own house in Geelong, where it was put up as Caraya Villa, which you see in this early view. There is today, and Everything you see there is original except the little square porch, which is done mostly in cast iron, but it's an addition. Everything you see there is cast iron, although it looks like the most ornamental timber barge board on a solid masonry wall. It's all cast iron. But the two other faces, we're seeing the two sort of street faces here, the two other faces behind have corrugated iron, heavy gauge corrugated iron rather than a plate iron facade. Coming in close, you can see these cast iron elements, which, because the barge board you see has been slightly cracked at the bottom, you realise it's not timber at all, but is in fact cast iron. When you look inside the walls, it's a bit difficult to make this out, but here with the lining taken off, what you're seeing are timber studs with those horizontal stripes which are where lath and plaster have been removed. Just ignore all that and look behind it, and you're seeing cast iron. They're like trays with edges pointing inwards, flanges pointing inwards, and they're bolted together through the flanges. And then the joint is run with red lead to make it totally tight and invisible from the outside. You just can't see these joints at all. But at the back, these cast iron stanchions were used, and the corrugated iron ran between them for the back wall of the building. That's the system used there. Again, not the Bell House patent system, just corrugated iron going into a groove, not into a curved, profiled slot. Now, leaving Scotland and going back to England, one of the biggest makers in England was Samuel Hemming of Bristol. He's in a way the most boring maker because he made timber-framed houses, no patent system at all, timber-framed houses clad in corrugated iron. But he did so on a giant scale, so big that one description says he built a complete village in his builder's yard each week. Shops, houses, churches and so on, demolished into packing cases and then built the next village and so on. And here's one of his one of the illustrations of the time showing the churches, shops and houses. And this other one, which shows a standard church type, about 4 of which at least came to Australia, slightly different sizes but the same type. The interior of one of them. And there's one that was put up in Bay Street, Port Melbourne, demolished later on, became a Sunday school in Collingwood and has now been demolished entirely. Another was put up at Williamstown, which again has been demolished. And a third one was put up at Gisborne, and it survives in part today. It was put up outside the town of Gisborne for the Church of England, moved into the town, and when the present church was built over the road, this became for a time a woolen mill, and then was reacquired by the church and survives as a large sort of shed-like building still today. There's one in Sydney, one of the grandest of these churches, on the same system of construction. He also made quite grand houses, this one for Sydney, but very humble houses as well. His smallest model, the top left, his cottage number 1, didn't even have any windows. The ends served as doors come windows with an awning to raise for ventilation. And you can see that this was seen as being more like a tent than a house. That's how a gold digger coming out to take a small house with him might have seen it. Because of course they became slums. They were very inadequate in later times, and when the slum clearance movement began in the 20th century, these were singled out for condemnation, as you see in the bottom picture. But grander houses also survive. These two houses in Brunswick Road, Brunswick, are a semi-detached pair, and there's another pair next to them which has been clad now in brickwork. As designed, this seems to have been a row of 4 as a terrace, but instead divided and built into two parts. And they have interesting construction. The tie rod, where you see the 2 is marked, is tensioned by pulling it up to the collar beam, and there are turnbuckles also to keep the whole thing tensed together. And then the very grandest house by Hemming is this one in New South Wales, or this is a very similar one in New South Wales, in which although it's still a corrugated iron clad house, cast iron is used for the balustrade parapet and the urns on the roof. So there at the top is the house, which is very similar to the one illustrated, Windsor Carriby at Bowral. And there you can see the walls with the cast iron top and the parapet. Now, turning to some other major buildings in Sydney, really quite distinctive buildings. The first one was the Royal Mint. The Royal Mint was in the complex of buildings behind the Rama Hospital in Macquarie Street, large colonial buildings. And the Mint was built to coin coins in Sydney and built by the Royal Engineers in these stone buildings behind. But in fact, although they're stone buildings, the structure within them is largely prefabricated iron. And you see here some of the roof trusses. Extremely interesting, especially the top one, the segmental form, which is more in the tradition of French construction than British construction. And the roof of the building is iron with slabs of slate dropped in, a bit like the panelled ceilings we've seen before, but a much heavier construction designed to be fireproof. But most of all, the framing below, you see these columns have girders with crisscross panels in them. That's all cast iron, and they're very similar to something much more famous building. There's the junction of them there. Similar to the construction of the Crystal Palace in London. And if you look at that picture there, you can see the panels with the crisscross diagonals across them. The girder being dropped into slots in the column. And there's the comparison. The Crystal Palace on the smaller scale version at the Royal Mint in Sydney. Undoubtedly, the Royal Engineers were inspired by the Crystal Palace in this construction. Here now another building in Sydney. This building survived as part of a factory complex, and see there's a nave at the higher part of the centre, and there was on either side, it's believed, two lower structures which have now gone. But the components of the nave largely survived and have now been reconstructed. And this was, we now believe, brought out as a brewery. Tooth Brewery had been burnt out, and they ordered a new structure from England. And this building was later on encased in other buildings and became part of a later factory, and was discovered in the 1990s, dismantled, and only in much more modern times reconstructed in the same general area. Here are some of the components, and on the top one you can see in the top column it's the work of H&MD Grizzel of the Regent's Canal Iron Works in London, very leading iron founders. At the bottom on some of the columns you see have those brackets at the sides, either to take the lower roof of the side aisles, and some of them also designed to take a crane rail, a removable crane, which was at that time a very modern development. And here are some details of it, showing those columns. You see the top part of the column has both the crane rail and the brackets for the side roof on it. But the truss in particular, look at the top right, is in the form of a Polonceau truss. It's a truss with a horizontal tie across the middle and then sloping ties down to either side, and they're spaced out with that rather odd decorative element. It's called a lily flower, which is a strut for no particular reason of that ornamental form. And these trusses were used in England from at least the 1830s commonly, almost always with that lily flower form, which became a sort of English tradition. They're used in France in quite a different form. That's what we're talking about there. And here are now, when the building is being moved, the original lily flower elements and the replacement ones used in the reconstruction on the right. And there it is, trusses being moved on the left and the reconstruction on the right. So this is the Grizzel building, which was in fact the Tooth Brewery building.